It's a real treat to be able to be here with you this evening. And I always enjoy coming out and speaking to groups like this one and other groups that get together to talk about conservative principles and what we can do to improve our government. And Dan certainly is an example of someone who's hard at work trying to do his part to make a difference and to improve the situation that we have both in our community, in our state, and in our country. He was a great assistance in the success that I had in 2010. It was an uphill battle that year. It was a real challenge. Well, I won't bore you with all of the details of the past and what we had to overcome, but it was very exciting to be able to see that success, and I owe it to great supporters like Dan and many individuals like yourselves who got involved and made a difference in that race. Well, I just want to tell you just a little bit about why I got involved in politics. And then, as Dan mentioned, I currently serve as the Appropriations Chairman in the House of Representatives, so I thought it might be beneficial or of interest to each of you to hear kind of the state of our Arizona state budget, a history of how we got to where we're at, and the obstacles that we've overcome, and the challenges that we have in front of us. And then it can also highlight on some other key issues that are before the legislature right now. But most importantly, I want to get to your guys' questions and speak in more detail about whatever topics you all might be thinking about right now and that you guys would like me to address. So as Dan mentioned, I first ran for the legislature in 2010. But that wasn't the first time that I became concerned about politics. It was actually at a pretty young age. In high school, when I kind of came of age and learned about the future that our country was facing, I was concerned, much as I'm sure each of you are. I was concerned about the trajectory that our country was on, that we were headed on a path towards bankruptcy, and I knew that we would not be able to pass on a country that was as strong and as free as the country that I was born into and that we inherited from our founding fathers' generation all the way down to the current generation, if we were in a fiscal situation that led to bankruptcy. We would not be able to finance the strong military that is key to the strength that we have in the world today. We would not be able to be the strong country and preserve and protect the freedoms that we all hold dear if we continued on this path towards fiscal insolvency. And so I was upset, and I was frankly quite frustrated when I learned that we had elected representatives to go back to D.C., and they had really mismanaged the country's finances. Later, I became a little bit more aware of what was going on at the state level as well, and as Dan mentioned, I went to work for an organization called the Arizona Tax Research Association, where we were analyzing the state budget, and I learned that a lot of these same critical questions are being decided at the state level as well. These questions about financing our future and about living within our means. So I was at the Arizona Tax Research Association at the time that you all remember in the Great Recession. We had a substantial budget deficit. And I saw that the decisions that the legislature at the time were making, they weren't the decisions that I thought needed to be made. And I believe the decisions that each of us expected of our government. And that is that we would live within our means. We would not spend more than we had. The state had much less wealth than it thought it had just a few months prior because of the result of the Great Recession. And that is new information that the state needed to act upon and spend less because the state was no longer as wealthy as they previously thought they were. And so I ran on a platform of making sure that if the voters entrusted me to send me down to the state legislature, that I would be a voice for fiscal responsibility, to make sure that we balanced our budget with no new taxes, that we balanced it with no new budget gimmicks, and that we balanced it with no new debt. That we just said, enough's enough. We'd already sold our capital and leased it back for 20 years. That revenue that we got from selling the capital was all spent in that year on salaries and benefits. It's gone, and we're going to be paying the debt for 20 years from that time. We had already instituted a record property tax increase with the return of the state equalization rate, a state property tax rate that shows up on your bill, $250 million property tax increase. We had already seen a record sales tax increase. You all remember the sales tax referral that went to the ballot, and the voters supported and raised the sales tax by nearly $1 billion. So the taxpayers and the future generations had already borne a substantial portion of the solution in closing this budget debt. But it was time for the state to make the difficult votes to actually reduce spending, to bring the spending down to the level that it needed to be with the new realities that had set in. And so that was the platform that I ran on. I was thrilled to get the support of the voters of District 19 at the time, and then after redistricting, District 25. And I was thrilled when I got down to the legislature, and as I was running, I learned that there was a whole lot of other individuals who were running on a similar platform with support from folks in Tea Party organizations like yourselves. We got down there and we said, you know what, enough's enough, it's time to balance our budget. And we did it. In that first year, we balanced the budget with no new taxes, no new debt, and no new budget gimmicks. But as I mentioned, the voters had already passed this $1 billion sales tax increase. So that was already built into the budget. It wasn't enough to close the deficit. We still had about $1 billion to close, and that's what we closed in that first year that I was down at the legislature. Well, so we had some time because this sales tax had passed, and it was set to expire within about 3 years. And so we set out to make sure that when that time came forward, that sales tax was set to expire, that the state would be in a position to be able to allow that sales tax to expire and not be in a position where we would have to come back to you and say, now we have $1 billion deficit because these revenues went away, and we're going to ask you to renew this sales tax, or we're going to create new budget gimmicks, or we're going to create new debt in order to close that deficit. And so in order to close that $1 billion deficit, there was more work to be done. And so we set out holding the reins on the growth of spending to make sure that we did not spend every single dime because we knew that those revenues were going away. We put money aside into the rainy day fund. We put several hundred millions of dollars into the rainy day fund. We built up the cash balance carry forward that went from one year to the next. And we were successful in creating enough revenue savings by not spending every dollar of this additional sales tax that the prior legislature had referred and the voters had approved. By not spending every dollar, we were in a position where when that sales tax went away, that $1 billion of revenue, we had enough revenue saved to be able to replace that $1 billion with the cash balance. And so that got us forward another year after the expiration of the sales tax. But of course, all of us know if you're dipping into your savings to pay your ongoing expenditures, at some point, that cash balance is going to be depleted. And so we would need to reduce our spending even further or find some other way to close this deficit. And so that was the last step, the last portion of the solution that was needed to a record deficit. So if you guys remember back to 2009, the deficit that we saw was $3.6 billion on a $10 billion budget. So it was extraordinary, the size of the problem. And that's why it took many years to overcome this problem. And what we did this last session was the final step. So that revenue went away. We replaced it with the cash balance. We depleted that cash balance until the solution a solution needed to be enacted. And that's what we did this last session. And you'll recall what we did. We passed substantial budget reductions in order to close that last piece of that $3.6 billion budget deficit. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what that solution looked like. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with it. You've read the papers. You've heard of the media reports on television and in the radio. But the major portion of the budget deficit reduction solutions came from the universities. You'll recall about $100 million of a reduction to our state universities. And while we got beat up on that reduction, it was more than the reduction that the rest of the state agencies. Maybe I'm stepping back too far. it was more of a reduction than most of our state agencies received, but in terms of the university's total budget, it was about 2% of their budget. So it is something that they can absorb. They are the one agency of the state that until this session had not been impacted at all in their spending since the Great Recession. Now they had cuts throughout the budget reduction processes that we've seen over the many years, but they've replaced every dime and more with tuition increases. And so they certainly can and should absorb some reductions in cost, reduce the amount that they're spending by 2%. That was a reasonable request. And so that's what they saw, and that was a major portion of the budget reduction solution that we passed in this last session. Now, how many of you think just by reading the papers or hearing the media on the radio and the television, how many of you think that there was a cut to K-12 education this last session? Yeah, if you're following the media, certainly that's the storyline, and that's the impression that was sold to the consumers of their media. Well, the reality was that the reason that the cut for the universities was so large was so that we could maintain the same funding level for our K-12 education system. Now you say, well, then why is it so widely reported that there was a cut to K-12 education? Well, the reason that it was reported as a cut is because they anticipated receiving an increase that was larger than the increase that we gave them. So we did increase their appropriation by a small amount, a nominal amount, but so essentially held their spending level constant, and yet that was widely reported as a cut to education, right? So and it is. It's the same old story. It's the same approach that many folks take to this argument, session after session. So those are the two major spending elements of the state budget. K-12 education is over 42% of the budget, and that was held harmless. The universities saw a bigger cut, and it was a real cut, but it was 2% in terms of their total spending, all of their revenues. And the community colleges saw a similar reduction of about 2% in their total spending. Then the rest of the budget saw budget reductions of around 2% in their actual state appropriation. And so then with those collective changes, we were able to close the budget deficit and finally have a balanced budget that did not rely on the temporary increase in the sales tax that the voters had approved previously. Now we're in a situation where we're not going to be coming back again this next session or the session after that and having to address another budget deficit. Now we're in a situation where as the state and the economy grows, then as we've seen more students coming into the K-12 education system, we'll be able to fund that student increase without having to look for more dollars because the state has right-sized the spending level, and now we can grow with the growth in the economy. So that was an accomplishment that while difficult to get to, is something that will pay dividends for many years to come. So I'm very excited about that accomplishment. I wanted to give you just kind of an update on where we're at prior to this session, what led up to the budget discussions that occurred back in January through April. So now, to give you a little bit of a preview of what we might see coming forward, now we're in a situation where the revenues have come in stronger than anticipated. One thing that we learned from the Great Recession is to make sure that you don't overestimate your growth in revenues and spend based on overly optimistic estimates of revenue growth. So we made sure that we held our estimates as conservatively as possible to make sure that we didn't find ourselves in that situation. And so we now find ourselves in the situation where revenues have come in stronger than anticipated, and we have an increase in the revenues that the state is going to see. And so we're in a stronger position going forward into the next session the big question on everybody's mind down at the Capitol and throughout the media is the K-12 education lawsuit. So you guys pretty familiar with the K-12 education lawsuit? So I see some head nods, some yeses, some no's. I'll just give you a brief overview of what's taken place with this lawsuit, because this is going to be the critical issue of the next session, if not sooner. We may come into a special session if the governor calls us into one to address this issue even prior to the end of the year. So a brief overview. In 2000, the voters passed Proposition 301. This proposition added a half of a cent, a 0.6 cent sales tax increase, and did many other things as well. So that sales tax increase largely went to education and some other beneficiaries as well. In addition to that sales tax increase, the voters also authorized a mandate that the total spending, that the base support level of your K-12 education funding formula increase for inflation every year. And so this was the question in this lawsuit, is what does Prop 301 require? Well, there's a clause in the statute that says that the legislature shall increase the base support level or other components of the equalization base for inflation each year. So during the Great Recession in 2009 and 10, the state took advantage of that option that the voters gave the state when they passed Proposition 301. The plain language of the statute said that the state had an option: increase the base support level or other components of the equalization base. Well, there's another component of the equalization base, and that's the transportation support level. The base support level is the major component of the funding formula. The transportation component is a small component of the funding formula. And so by not inflating the base support level and only inflating the transportation support level, the state saved a substantial amount of money by not increasing spending. So again, it wasn't a cut. It just wasn't as large of an increase as they otherwise would have received. Well, the plaintiff sued, and Janet Napolitano, when she was the Attorney General, wrote an opinion that said, in this case, or means and. It means you don't have an option. It means you have to do both. Well, that words don't mean anything, and that is absolutely a fallacy. I mean, if we were to go through the statutes and see how many times the statutes give an option with the conjunction or, and say that now means and, then it would turn our statutes on their head, and there would be a mess within the state statutes. So it really is a ridiculous opinion that the Attorney General at the time issued. Unfortunately, neither of the two Republican Attorney Generals that we've had since overturned that opinion. So when we were sued, the legislature, the House of Representatives, was the only party that said that the conjunction or gave the state an option. The state, the Attorney General representing the state, said that in this case or meant and, which was frustrating and very, very upsetting. Well, that decision was litigated. It got up to the Supreme Court because the state, under the Attorney General's representation, did not ask the Supreme Court to rule on whether or, in fact, means or. The Supreme Court took a pass on that, and they said, you know what, the state hasn't asked us to rule on this, so we're not going to. And they remained silent, and they just ruled on some other arguments that the Attorney General had made and ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And so the impact of that ruling was that the state had to fund both the increase in inflation for both the transportation component and the major component, the base support level. So that was the ruling. Then it was sent back to the district court to determine what is the impact, what are the dollars that the state will need to come up with in order to make whole and to comply with this judgment. The state argued, well, in several years prior to the Great Recession, the state increased spending by more than the amount that Prop 301 required. So that inflation factor, in every year it was applied to both the transportation component and the base support level, and in some years it was inflated by more than the inflation requirement of Proposition 301. So the state argued that that the only requirement of Proposition 301 is that minimum inflation increase for every year. And if you carry that out to the current year, not inflating any more than what is required by Proposition 301, then the increase is $74 million to our base support level. The state funded that last appropriation, funded that level. So we're already funded at the level that the state argues is required by Proposition 301. Well, the plaintiffs and the lower court ruling in favor of the plaintiffs said that the state doesn't get credit for those years in which it inflated the spending level by more than the amount required by Prop 301. The plaintiffs and the lower court ruling in favor of the plaintiffs said that you have to increase the prior year's amount for inflation regardless of the level that prior year was inflated to. And that dollar figure is $336 million more than the $74 million that we've already increased. So $336 million a year going forward every year and inflating that amount every year, plus $336 million a year for the 3 years that we use the or option rather than the and option. So you add that up, it's over $1 billion of back payments plus the $336 million each year going forward. So this is the critical issue. That's why the governor's proposed a plan of using the state trust land. Originally, he said that this would just be an increase or bringing forward some payments to the school districts, but it would not address the settlement now. It would not be used to resolve the lawsuit. Now there's ongoing discussions about what we're going to do moving forward with K-12 education to address this lawsuit and to address what the governor's proposed with the state land trust proposal that he's put out there. So that's a brief update. So now that we're all happy and optimistic about the next session that we're going to see, I also wanted to give you just a little bit of an update on some other key issues that we might see at the state legislature in this next session, and also some other key successes that we've seen down at the state legislature. First of all, one big success that I'm very excited about, it was a bill that I worked on, it was 3 years ago. I first passed a bill that said that, now you guys all know how our income taxes work in both at the federal level and at the state level. We have a graduated income tax, graduated rates that are applied to your income tax bracket. So the more you earn, the higher rate that you pay. Well, at the federal level, the federal government indexes those tax brackets to inflation. So that means that if the federal government determines that if your adjusted gross income is $0 to $10,000, you're gonna pay one rate. If it's $10,000 to $20,000, that income is going to be taxed at a higher rate. Well, in the next year, that $10,000 cutoff is not the same as it was in the prior year because of inflation. And so because your real wealth, that $10,000 limit, is less in that year, we're going to shift that up. You've actually got to earn a little bit more before that higher rate applies. Well, in Arizona, we never did that. We never indexed our tax brackets to inflation, which means that every year, as the value of your earnings and your 401k withdrawals and whatever earnings you're taxed on, as the value of those decline due to inflation, you're actually taxed at a higher rate on those earnings because we hadn't indexed our tax brackets to inflation. So this is it's called bracket creep. It's a hidden tax increase that was occurring year after year after year every time that we saw inflation and didn't adjust our income tax bracket. So I ran a bill that said, you know what, we need to address this. We need to stop raising taxes every year without any action on the part of the legislature. You know, if we want to raise taxes, then the legislature needs to affirmatively vote to do that, and then you all can hold us accountable, or those that support that tax increase. It shouldn't increase on its own automatically. So I ran that bill, got up to Governor Brewer, and she vetoed it 3 years ago. And she said that she was concerned about the impact that it would have on the budget. She's open to the idea, but wants to evaluate it on a year-by-year basis. So I said, okay, well that's, I'm disappointed that it was vetoed, but there's something that I can work with here. So the next year I came back and I said, okay, well I'm just going to adjust the brackets in this bill for 1 year. And the governor can evaluate that in the terms of this budget, and then I'll come back in the next year and and I'll do the same thing. And so I ran ran that bill. I advocated for including the impact on revenues in the budget discussions. Was able to get that $5 million tax cut into the budget, so that it actually was paid for in the budget by a reduction in spending. And then the governor signed the bill. So again, it had an impact of 1 year. We had scored it at about $5 to $6 million, and the budget actually ended up being significantly more than that, around $10 million in tax savings to every, collectively to all income taxpayers. So we passed that. And that year, I came back the next year with a new governor. I knew that the new governor might have a different view on making this a permanent adjustment that occurs every year without having to come back every year and pass a bill. So I was the first bill that I drafted, and it was actually the first bill that was introduced in the legislature. It was House Bill 2001. I got up and talked to Governor Ducey early on about this bill and talked to his staff. And I was very excited when he gave his State of the State address, his first inaugural State of the State address. He included in his comments that he wanted to pass this bill. And so we got that bill up to him, got it signed, and got the pen that he signed that bill with. And I was very excited that now, every year going forward, until some legislature or governor makes a change that you all can hold them accountable for by affirmatively changing or repealing that adjustment, every year you're going to see tax savings, or you're not going to see this hidden income tax raise or increase that otherwise would have occurred as a result of this bill. So that's something I'm very excited about. One additional item that I wanted to give you a heads up on, and then we'll get to questions. So hopefully you guys are all thinking about what additional topics you guys would like me to cover. The pension systems in the state, I'm sure you guys many of you are very familiar, are in dire circumstances. These pension systems, many of them are funded at levels that are frankly bordering on bankruptcy, even below 50%, some of them. ASRS is in a little bit of a stronger position, the Arizona State Retirement System, that our teachers and state personnel are in. PSPRS, which is our Public Safety Retirement System, is in a really difficult position. They each have separate systems. Every city, every fire department, every police department has their own system. Some of them are funded at better levels than others, but collectively, PSPRS is in very, very bad shape. And so what this means is that, similar to Social Security, there's a large deficiency that the current or the retirees who are benefiting from the fund did not pay in enough to support the benefits that they're currently receiving. And so the system requires new employees to come in, and those employees contribute more than the cost of their future benefits in order to pay the benefits of existing retirees and future retirees. What's that? And they love that. Well, not only are they not wild about that, but cities now have recognized that it is very, very difficult for them to cope with this situation. If they're going to hire a new police officer, it is extremely costly because of this amortized deficiency that they have to pay on the retirement benefits for the new hire that they're bringing on. So any potential increase in pay to keep the salaries competitive is completely swallowed up with the cost of this unfunded liability. So cities have realized, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Not only have cities recognized this, the current retirees and the current employees have recognized, there's a real possibility that when I retire, this might be bankrupt, and I might not get anything like Social Security. That's exactly right. And so they also recognize there is a real problem that has to be addressed. We have to address the unfunded liability within these pension systems. So this creates a unique opportunity that I'm excited about, and I'm hopeful that we might be able to see some reforms that will be very, very beneficial for the taxpayer and for the state and for the systems as well. It will create some surety and some certainty for those who are relying on these retirement benefits that they were promised, and for future generations who are coming into the police service or the fire department and so on and so forth, that they can enter into this system and have some sort of sense of peace that they're actually going to be able to retire and rely on this income when they get to that point. And so what we are looking at are some major reforms. And everything is on the table. We are having ongoing discussions with all of the interested individuals, the employees, the cities and towns, and the organizations that represent the employees, the unions, and we're trying to come to an agreement. The public safety unions have agreed and made some major concessions that will be beneficial to increasing the funded status of these funds. So I'm excited about that. I don't think that they've proposed something that goes far enough. So we've got some more work yet to do, and we're continuing those discussions, and hopefully going to get to a point where they can be supportive of what we've proposed. We may have to send something to the ballot, and it certainly will be much easier to get the support of the voters if we have the support of the affected individuals as well. You have to excuse me, I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So, it's not mine. I wish it was. That'd be nice. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So that's a very important issue that will be coming before the state this next session. We are looking at shifting a portion of the retirement benefit to a defined contribution system. So we'll be shifting some of that liability away from the state, away from the taxpayers, and also giving employees some portability. So it will mirror what folks see in the private sector. A certain amount of a defined benefit, which private sector, thank you so much, private sector folks get from their Social Security, as well as some defined contribution that private sector employees receive from their 401k. So